Selective coatings. Nice. Try 5 pairs for free at warbyparker.com. These folks, they don't have time.
Okay, and I'm getting a little extra noise from someone. So if anyone could just make sure that they're muted as we get going, that would be awesome.
If you want, I can keep an eye on the chat for you and kind of just give you a heads up.
Okay.
When you got a question in the chat.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Yeah, I know sometimes trying to like mod your own room, mod during
it's a little exciting.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I'm willing to give people a couple more minutes, so no horrible excitement yet. Okay, I haven't seen anyone come in, so I'm going to say let's go ahead and get started. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Tika England, and I am both a professional and a non-professional. I'm an SCA member, so I'm a reenactor, but I also have a degree in costume technology, so I sort of come at this from both sides. I usually tell people this started out as an SCA class, so I kind of focus in Society for Creative Anachronism time period, which is sort of like mumbledy beginning to about 1600. But a lot of the stuff that I'll talk about, you can sort of take out of just sort of white Europe into other places, and you can take definitely beyond 1600. Sort of anytime you can find art, you can use a lot of these ideas. So as I said in there, sadly, most of this is sort of European based because that's where most of my expertise is, but you can carry it over into Eastern African New World cultures too. Just find the art. I realize I should start talking about this, and I should start teaching this class more. When I suddenly realized that people don't look at art the same way I did. I am a costume technologist is generally what I call myself. I work as the cutter draper, so I'm in charge of making all the patterns to go into sort of theatrical performances. So a lot of my job is looking at art, whether it's historic art or whether it's art a designer has handed me, and going, great, what do you mean? How does this become reality? Obviously on modern stuff or on sort of theoretical stuff with designers, a lot of this is sort of just like, I can make it up as I go. But in historic stuff, there's definitely sort of a precedent set for this is how it would have been done. And I often tell people, sadly, how I learned to do that was a combination of staring at things way too long and trying to make them myself and just like immersing in one thing. So if you look at books like Janet Arnold, you look at existing garments from the period, it's just a lot of training yourself to see kind of all the pieces and how they go together. So I'll say that numerous times throughout this, that the best thing you can do if you're interested in getting better at seeing sort of clothing construction and so forth in art, the best thing you can do is just stare at it, stare at patterns, stare at clothes, stare at artwork, stare at everything, stare at people who have made them before, just keep learning. Okay, so what I'm looking for as I look at art, the first thing is silhouette. I believe this is my first slide, so let's see if I can advance that. There we go. So the first, nope, only wanted one. Go back, there we go. So the first thing that I'm looking at is silhouette as I try to get back to my notes. Too many things, too little space on the computer. So do I see the outline of the body or is it more blousy? Is going to be one of the first big giveaways as to sort of what period you're looking at. So the earlier in time something is, the more likely it is to be rectangular construction. which is basically everything in the garment is made of rectangles, squares, triangles, things like that. That's the most effective way to use fabric. So if you're having to create all your own fabric to then, cut up and use, weaving takes time and effort. So the more efficient you can be, the less fabric you have to make. And then you can have a garment that much faster. So pre about 1300-ish, a lot of clothing was very rectangular. You can see that in the French Bible there with the name that I won't try to say because I'm not French and I'm bad at languages. But you can see sort of how those are kind of blousy. They're not really fitted to bodies. You can see some belts. You can see like the sleeves are a little fitted around the arm. Most clothing was T-tunics, over-tunics, sort of Byzantine robes, bleouts, even sort of the fitted like Norse Thorsberg trousers were pretty rectangular. After that, interestingly enough, rectangular construction starts to transition to become underlayers. So if you look at like Tudor shirts, Tudor chemises, even up into like the Regency shirts and some chemises after that, a lot of it is still very sort of rectangular. After 1300, we start seeing a lot more of the body. So you start seeing sort of the self-supporting coat-hardies that, hold everything up where they should be. You start seeing shaped men's hose. You start seeing in the 1500s garments that change the shape of your bodies, whether it's like the pumpkin hose that's standing out from the legs or like peascod bellies, bodices on women that are stiffened to sort of smooth them out. You can see sort of in my French lady there in the pink, you can see that there's definitely a shape to her. You can see her body. She may even be being helped slightly by the garment to sort of create that shape. You can see there's a lot more sort of detail in kind of what the sleeves are doing. They're not necessarily just the plain sleeves we see in the rectangular. And you can see in her skirt, there's a lot of pleating and so forth around her waist. So we're starting to get into it's not just covering the body, it's now sort of shaping to the body and creating new shapes. So a lot of learning silhouettes, I said I'm going to say it again, I'm going to say it a million times, is looking at them. So if you're interested in a specific era or a specific place, especially if you're doing reenactment of some sort, and your research revolves around that specific era and or that specific place, if you're staring at that long enough, eventually you'll be able to say, oh, this doesn't look right for all the other stuff that I've been seeing from this time and place. When you first sort of get into an era, it's harder to tell, but after a while you will develop that eye. It's another just stare at it as long as you can. So another thing that I'm looking at as I go into creating costumes or garments of any type is fabric behavior. So what is the fabric doing? Is it stiff? Is it drapey? Is it loose? Is it folded? Is it tucked? Is it showing strain? What do I see the fabric doing? And what does that tell me about what the fabric was and or how it was sewn? So as the art gets more detailed and mediums change, this gets a lot easier. So what a Norse carver may show as sort of a just triangular garment that sticks out from the hips, a later artist may be able to, with sort of more refinement in the art, sort of drop that garment and sort of show how it shapes over the hips better. Shadows and shading in art, as we get sort of more detailed in art, can tell you a lot. They can show you sort of numerous different types of pleats. So if you think of like a Tudor skirt versus like a Kranich gown, the Tudor skirts a lot of times are knife pleated, so you'll see sort of sharper lines, and the Kranich gown is rolled pleats. So if you look at the two examples, you can see sort of the rolled pleats in the Adoration of the Magi, where they look a lot rounder. I didn't get a good knife pleat example in here because I ran out of slide room, but you can see the rolled pleats. You can see the fabric on the Arnolfini portrait, the fact that you can see sort of the pleats that start up here on her and then continue below the belt implies that there's probably not a waistline in there because it is belted. So you can see sort of those tucks continuing through. Could there be a waist seam in there? Yes. Would it be likely? Probably not. If there had been a waist seam, it would have been unlikely, and this is even from personal experience, go out and do it, go out and look at things. from personal experience, it's really hard to get pleats or tucks to line up perfectly across a waist seam. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's one of those, is it Godwin's law? No, Godwin, I think Godwin's law is the Nazi, but there's a law that is basically like the most probable thing is probably what you're seeing. So there's no reason to think that there's a waist seam in there. Similarly, if you're looking at fabric on pants, so if men are wearing pants or hose, they're so tight you can see the outside, the silhouette of their leg. There's a good chance that fabric is stretchy somehow. Think about what your legs look like in, chinos or in jeans versus in leggings. Like you can see the outline of a leg in the leggings, you can't in so much in jeans. If they're stretchy, and we know that knits weren't common, in these periods that we're looking at, especially with our adoration of the Magi men, there's a good chance these were cut on the bias, because that's the way you can get sort of non-knit fabric to be stretchy. So that's just sort of knowing, again, it's, a lot of things that come into play, sort of knowing about the period, knowing what would have been there, knowing what fabrics could have been used. Occam's razor, there we go. The simplest explanation is usually correct. Godwin's law has come up a lot more recently, so that's the one I've got in my brain. So like I was saying, do I know what fabrics are common in this time period and how often they were used is sort of the next fabric question I ask myself. This can assist you in seeing sort of different treatments, like seam treatments and shapes in clothes. So a linen garment, for anyone who's ever worn linen, it sort of falls, it wrinkles a lot. It will behave very differently visually than a thicker wool garment would. And a wool garment will be even more different if it's lined in fur, which you can see is happening in our Arnolfini portrait. A lot of the ways you can sort of see fabric behave, if you know the layers, is in images of folks partially undressed or in time off. So there are a lot of images you can find, not portraits, but in paintings you can find of, sort of the farmers are out having lunch and the man has like undone part of his jacket and you can see an underlayer. If you know that underlayer is generally linen, you can see how that's depicted and how that sort of compares or contrasts with his outer layer. Does it look like it's behaving the same? Does it look like it's different? Does that imply those are two different fabrics? Similarly with women who have more than one layer of skirt on, are the fabrics in that artwork portrayed as behaving the same? Can you see a difference between, like, if you knew the wool petticoats were common in that time period, can you see a difference between a wool petticoat and a velvet overskirt if someone has their skirt pulled up? Obviously, probably not the farmers at that point, but you get the idea. The next thing I'm looking for in artwork is seam lines, which I think is my next slide. There we go. So seam lines. Do I see any visible seam lines? Has the artist given me sort of the ultimate, like, here's how this went together clue? Sometimes artists are so detailed, they'll do that for you. Usually that's in portraits. And they'll paint in either seam lines or you'll see sort of a shadow where fabrics kind of come together. Often that also implies a velvet fabric or something with a pile, if you can sort of see that seam line shadow. Because if anyone's ever sewn velvet, like there's no way to get it to sort of, perfectly meld back together. Other times you can see seam lines if the fabrics are different. So you can see in my, what is her name here? My lady in the very loud brocade, my saints over there on the right, her red fabric and her gold fabric, different fabrics, you can tell. So there is probably a seam line in there connecting those two together. Similarly, it's harder to see, but on Marguerite Stahlberg, you can see there's a black line around here, which means that probably that is sewn on some way to the blue. It's not just sort of a freestanding other random thing. Occasionally what looks like the band is another layer. So if we're looking at guards on sort of St. Elgius or on Marguerite Stahlberg, if you're looking at those, sometimes that will be another layer that sort of comes out and folds back, or, a guard on the bottom of a skirt may actually be a second skirt. So some of that is again, knowing silhouettes, knowing the layers that were likely to have happened in the period that you're looking at. If I don't see any seam lines, is there any indication with the behavior of the fabrics, the closures, or the fastenings as to where they might be? So that kind of builds on, do I see any seam lines? And sort of jumps us to closures and fastenings. So in Marguerite, you can see that there are fastenings sort of down her front, which implies also that probably that opens more, and that may be the way into the dress. Knowing about this time period, the Germans were really good at doing sort of creative, like flap over closures, where in the portraits you can't tell where they are. If you think of sort of a lot of the famous Anna Cleves portraits, you can't necessarily tell where they are, but the closures and playing how do you get into this can sort of help you figure out the seam lines. On Marguerite, you can see there's sort of a wavy white line that works down her front from kind of under her lacy buttons. That is most likely fur lining to that dress. So that is giving you sort of the indication of, oh, this is kind of like a coat that then laces together. Similarly, in the image of St. Elgius, you can see a very, very fine lacing in the red front of her dress. And she doesn't have it fully closed. So that implies to me, at least, that because there's a lacing there and a big wide belt around it, that dress probably drops over her head, laces up, and has a belt. Similarly with the two men in that portrait, one has his coat open, which is great. You can see the fur, you can see, you know, sort of where everything is, you can see how easily how he would get into that. And since the silhouette of that coat on him and the man in the blue is so similar to the silhouette of the coat of the man in red, just without the fur and without it open, you can sort of infer that likely the guy in sort of the orangish red has a front closure on that coat, tunic, whatever you want to call it as well. Similarly, if we look at sort of the different fabrics in that image, which are awesome, the blue to me looks like velvet, and you can sort of see up on his shoulder, you can see what I was talking about with sort of that shadow seam line of like, there's something going on up here. And since that's a real common place to put a seam line, my belief would then be, there's a seam that puts his sleeve on. Similarly, the guy in orange or orangish red, you can see pleats going into there, which again is a good indication of there's a seam line here. And then I left mine Agnes in here with Dürer because a lot of times if you can find pre-studies or sort of pencil drawings by artists, that's when they've looked at the seam lines and gone, yes, like I see a line here, I'm gonna draw it in. Sometimes they're less obvious in the finished portraits, but Dürer and any of the artists of this period or later periods that you can find sort of studies from are oftentimes great at getting seam line information from. So on mine Agnes, you can see sort of down her underarm, there's definitely, that's telling me there's a seam probably there. My guess would be, again, knowing this time period, that that's probably either a 3 or 4 piece bodice. So there would be a seam down here and probably one down center back, and then you can see her closure starting up here, similarly to Marguerite's, which is probably there's an opening down the front of that dress again for her to get in and out. All right, which brings us again to sort of, I did another whole slide on closures, and did I do another? This may be my closures and fastening side. That was my closures and fastening side. Good, because I've pretty much talked about it already. So like I was saying on closures and fastenings, and I'll jump back there. Been a hot second since I looked at these notes. Thanks for hanging with me. Sometimes closures and fastenings, you can see them. They are very apparent, like on Marguerite. Sometimes they're almost invisible unless you zoom way in. Later on, I'll show you a photo, or not a photo, a portrait in which you can actually see pinheads holding the front of her dress shut, but you have to zoom way in. Sometimes you can only see part of the fastenings. So on a lot of the German Kranich dresses, you can see some lacings, but not enough to kind of know where they go. And that's where cross-referencing both with sort of archaeological evidence and previous people who have done the research can help. Closures are where a lot of times I'll go back to reenactors or other people who have recreated dresses and sort of look at them and go, what did you do with this? Because a lot of times people will do a blog post or a write-up on the decisions that they made and why they made those decisions. And if they say, this didn't work, obviously you can make a different choice. You can come to a different conclusion. But seeing folks' thought process can help. Obviously, if you can see closures, you can generally figure out what they're doing. You can guess pinheads, you can guess hooks and eyes, you can usually see buttons. Lacing is always kind of a pretty obvious one. So if you can see closures, they'll give up the game. You know sort of what they're doing then. Closures is actually another place where knowing what was common in the time period you're looking at is also helpful. So if I see, for instance, a Norse tunic with points, with, you know, tie-on ribbons or hooks and eyes or something like, or buttons, that's immediately suspect to me. And I would check the dates on the artwork probably and go, I feel like this may be someone making it up, which again, we'll come back to that whole concept at the end of this nonsense. All right, so the next thing that I look at as I'm looking at stuff, and this is a lot of, here's what I do. As I'm looking at garments and art, I'm looking at how accurate are they to patterns that exist, garments that I know about already that also exist. Have I seen a pattern breakdown of a garment of this time period before? And does the art seem to agree with what I know of the patterns or of the actual garment? So this is an awesome research point, especially because we can get books now that show pattern pieces and shapes. So I've got an example in here of the doublet and Plotter hose from Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion. Those garments exist, those patterns exist. So we know that in this time period in, I believe, Sweden, that's how, at least whoever made these garments, that's how they were making doublets, that's how they were making Plotter hose. There's no reason to think that everyone then was reinventing the wheel. So if we have one pattern for a thing, usually, again, Godwin's Law, or Occam's Razor, not Godwin's Law, Occam's Razor, usually other people's patterns are going to look pretty similar. If I'm looking at a Tudor or later garment in artwork, I'm likely to check in with Janet Arnold and just say, does this agree with what you saw? Other research also exists sort of in other books. So the Victoria and Albert have a bunch of books that lay out sort of pattern pieces taken from existing garments. If you can find existing garments online or in books and just look at them and say, does this agree with what I'm seeing in the art? That's another great way to go about it. There are also a bunch of sort of how to make your own patterning books that have been pretty well researched and give you good background in what you're looking at. They won't give you the patterns, but they'll give you the general shapes of the pieces that you're looking at. And I've left a bunch of those sort of in the handout down at the end so people can get to those. I'm thinking of looking up at the bookshelf. I'm thinking of the Tudor Tailor doesn't necessarily give you the pattern, but gives you a pretty good overview of like, these are the shapes you're looking at. The Medieval Tailor's Apprentice, again, doesn't give you the pattern per se, but gives you a good overview of these are the shapes that would have existed. As a last resort, if you're like, I've got nothing else to look at, please help someone, oh God, you can look at the shapes commercial patterns are putting out for the time period that you're interested in. Obviously, they're not going to be necessarily the most historically accurate, especially if you're looking at the big four pattern companies, the ones you find at a Joann's or at a Hobby Lobby. But they a lot of times are similar because there is, another truth of like, if you want it to look like this, the pattern pieces are probably going to be pretty similar to what they were using sort of back in the day to get that shape. A lot of times those are good shapes, they just don't necessarily sort of make up into garments as well. It's also always worth a Google on, thing I'm trying to make pattern, just to see what other people online have come up with and sort of check against them. Like I've shown you here, the layout for the Finnish Iron Age Jura underdress doesn't really like give you the pattern per se, but sort of shows you the shapes that you're looking at in it. I believe there is an entire Jura dress somewhere, or at least there is, from about the waist up, that exists somewhere. And a lot of Norse stuff, you're kind of working from fragments and best guesses. So especially if you're back in time on that end of the world and things have rotted, it all becomes a little more hypothetical. All right. Does what I'm seeing in the art agree with any live garments of the era I've seen before? I kind of touched on this already. If I'm looking at, something from the 1500s, can I find a museum that has a garment from the 1500s and has a bunch of good research images somewhere that I can look at? Most museums are absolutely willing to sell you big, fancy, expensive coffee table books of their garment collections. There are a billion of them out there. There's a lot of demand for pretty coffee table books. And I've got some of those listed down in the end of the handout as well, in case you need more pretty coffee table books. Also, museum curators tend to be big nerds just like us. So if you reach out to them and say, hey, I'm looking for more pictures of this thing in your collection, a lot of times they're willing to send you whatever pictures they have. Or if you have a very specific question and you manage to pique their interest, sometimes they'll, run out and take a picture of the thing for you. All right, next thing I'm looking at, next slide. Do others exist? Does what I'm seeing in the piece of art that I'm looking at agree with other art from this time period or location? When you're doing sort of this check, it can be as detailed and time consuming or as undetailed and fast as you want it to be. Essentially, can you find what you think you're seeing in one piece of art in at least one other piece of art, if not more? If you can, you've probably found a reasonably accurate depiction of a garment. If, however, you can only find one or very few, sort of fewer than 5, fewer than 10, you're probably looking at something not entirely accurate. There are a couple of reasons that I generally find for this. It's depicting, if you're looking at art depicting a saint or someone sort of non-human or very special, a lot of times they will have garments or hats that sort of mark them out as being different. I've found a lot of these sort of weird, almost turbans, but not, that kind of come around and then roll up. They look almost like sort of the padded head rolls that we know were worn, but they have this sort of curvy front bit. One of the places I find them most in art is on female saints. I think it's around 1300, late 1300s. I don't think I have ever found one on an actual just boring old human. It's always Saint Agatha or Saint someone else. So sometimes hats, especially some garments, will be marking this person is a saint or this person is different somehow. This is a non-human. Another possible reason you're not finding them, not finding garments sort of across a series of portraits, is they're being depicted by someone not from their culture or not from their time. So people seeing garments cross-culturally, or people going, oh, I want to, it's the 1920s and I want to paint the medieval times, don't quite understand how it all goes together. I'll get into talking primary and secondary a little farther on. I promise we'll get there. Similarly, there are a lot of artists that do medieval art that just isn't accurate, especially if they're from a later time period. Romanticism happened and we wanted knights and ladies in shining armor and long hair and all of that, and it was pretty, it wasn't accurate. So checking your time periods is on your art is always important. The third reason that I generally find for clothes being a little weird is that it's a piece of the time period, but is by who I call the proto-surrealist, or a monk with an agenda sometimes. Hieronymus Bosch painted a lot in the time period, but it was bizarre. The stuff he painted was not just sort of scenes I see every day. I mean, we're talking monkeys with faces in their stomachs and the flames of hell and things like that. So he was less interested in accurately portraying clothing than he was in scaring you away from whatever it was you were doing that was bad. Similarly, monks sometimes get into that. If you're looking at illuminations on some things, if we're depicting hell, the idea is scare you out of hell, not show you the fashions of hell. So I tend to put less stock in those. If other things in like I was like with those, if other things in the paintings are suspect as far as realism, don't believe the clothes. Alternatively, on clothing sort of through paintings, sometimes if you find a garment in only a few places, but you still, for whatever reason, believe it's a real garment, you have to look beyond the art. A while ago, I think it was like 9 years ago, I did a project on researching Miniver caps, which are those sort of weird white diamond-shaped hats. The most famous one is in A Knight's Tale. I can't remember that Jocelyn, I believe the lead female wears one. And it's this sort of bizarre white hat and her long white like felt robe. And everyone was like, "No, that's a fake hat. Those didn't exist." Those exist. You can find them in portraits. You can actually find a lot of written stuff about them too. They actually show up more in the written documentation than in portraits. I think I've found something like 10 or 12 in art, but I found like 4 or 5 written descriptions of these and people saying, this is against sumptuary laws and they shouldn't be wearing them, and all of that. So sometimes you can't just rely on the art. You have to go somewhere else to confirm, like, yes, this is actually a thing that exists. So in the slide here, we're basically looking at 3 women all in essentially the same garment across a pretty tight time span, showing that obviously this black sort of over jacket with the puff sleeves and the tight cuff likely existed, because we're seeing it in a bunch of different styles of art. We're seeing them in a couple of different locations. So if you were to say, "Oh, I want to make one of these black overgowns," yeah, that existed. That's a thing that could probably, you could do that. All right, so into the second section of this, how do you choose art to trust? Now that you've sort of heard what I as a professional look for in art as I'm doing this, how do I choose what art to trust? Sometimes, here are my saints and oddities. I didn't realize, man, I need to go back and look at my slides sometime. So these are some of the things I was talking about in saints and in sort of weird hats and so forth. So Joanna 1 over there on the left of Castile is wearing about 8 layers. She is the only person I have ever found in artwork from that time period wearing this many layers, because she has on basically a sideless surcoat, a short-sleeved gown, a long angel-winged gown, and then what looks to be sort of rust-colored, long-sleeved, tight-sleeved coat hardy under it. I've never found someone wearing quite that many layers in that configuration before. So because we know this was a religious text and she is a saint, you can tell because of the halo, probably apocryphal dress. Similarly, my personification of philosophy, somehow I doubt people were walking around split half white, half black in face paint. In garments, maybe, probably not in the face paint. And then my Mary Magdalenes are one of the hat depictions that I often find of either Mary Magdalene or of other sort of female saints with these kind of weird ear coverings. I'm still working on what those were, whether they were real, whether they were sort of apocryphal, but Mary you find a lot with these sort of, they're not even ear irons, but just sort of doohickeys and sort of tiara bits there. All right. There we go. Okay, so how do you choose art to trust? Sometimes it's the only art you have. So I've done a fair amount of research on the Vikings, on the Norse, and they don't leave you a lot of art. What you have is runestone art, you have some Valkyrie pendants, you have a bunch of carvings, you have a couple of tapestries, and then you get, this amount of fabric from a grave or from a boat somewhere, from a dig somewhere, and you have to play like, does this match what I'm seeing here? And then of course in the case of Valkyries you have to play, is this depicting a real human? Like, are you depicting a human wearing, or a Valkyrie wearing what a human would be wearing, or are you setting the Valkyries aside from humans because they are, sort of supernatural creatures? So here you can see in the Oseberg tapestry a lot of sort of what looks like long tunics, potentially with the slit up the side. You can see the women. This is one of the places that a lot of reenactors look at. Up in the right corner, you can see what is probably 3 women, and they all seem to have some sort of shawl and kind of a long train on them. Some reenactors have taken to that and said, this is of course what that is. This is what we're wearing. You can see Freya with the hair, which is someone saying in the chat, early Princess Leia. There has been a find, I know, of a preserved body. I don't want to say she was a bog body, but it was something like that. She was preserved well enough in Scandinavia to see hair, and she did have an actual like knot at the back of her head. So that in combination with the Freya, like this Freya does sort of imply that like hair knots, we've got two things that prove that now. So that was probably likely. But then another one of the reenactorisms you see a lot is that sort of hanging, people call it the tea towel, where you've got just that rectangular bit hanging down in the front of a Norse apron dress. And that is a direct interpretation of things like this, where you can see that rectangle in front of Freya, but not up here sort of how it's connected or what it's connected to. So people are making kind of their best guess from what we've got on the Norse. Sometimes you have to guess with art because it's the only art you've got. Other times you have art and an existing garment, which is awesome. So that shows us both how it was done and how it was depicted. So if we can see like on the actual garment and in the portrait, these lines match, we both obviously, like, we trust the garment is from that time period, and we know that the artist and the art is probably trustworthy as far as, you know, how did the garment go together. So these are the Fasolo family portrait and the Crimson Pisa dress are from essentially the same era in Italy. They're a little farther away than I wanted them to be, but such is life. They're both in Italy in the same time period. And as you can see, especially if you can zoom in on the Fasolo family, or on the family portrait, that dress and the Eleanor of Toledo Lady in Waiting dress are very similar. Like, they have almost the same lines. The biggest difference looks to me to be the trim, possibly the fabric, and possibly how the skirt was connected. The rest of it, the general shapes are there. They are very similar. The second example I've chosen here, if you remember a few slides back, we saw that pattern from Janet Arnold, which was taken off this set of clothing at Uppsala Cathedral. So this one for Nils Stuer is sort of the trifecta of everything you could want to say, yes, this is how a garment works, and I can see it live, I can see a pattern that someone has taken, I can see it in the art, these all agree, this is a thing, this is amazing. So this is a portrait of Nils Stuer from 1560-ish. And then we've got the clothing that the Stuer brothers were in when they were murdered. And then we have the patterns that Janet Arnold took off those clothes. So if you can get sort of a wham, bam, 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 bam like that, like, awesome. That is, as someone trying to remake historic clothing, that is what you want. Art to trust, portraits done by well-known artists are often trustworthy. I will not say always, and like I said before, it's even better if you can find sort of their pre-sketches on a bunch of these where they try to sort of capture all the details before they go back in and paint. Especially Hans Holbein is awesome at that. Dürer did a bunch of woodcuts, so if you can find woodcuts, and we'll kind of come back to woodcuts in a second. Anything that is not paint and is just lines tends to give you a lot of good information. This is Jane Seymour by Hans Holbein the Younger on the left, and I've zoomed her in so you can actually see pins fastening the front of her overdress. Like, he went in and put in the tiny little gold pinheads. And Dürer, you can see he was really good in painting at capturing sort of fabric wrinkles and wrinkles of garments and stuff like that. The thing to be careful with in portraits, though, is that if you start seeing the same portrait over and over again, some are copies of the original, and artists may start, you know, taking liberties with the clothes to try to differentiate their portrait from other people's. Especially, you can see this a lot in Elizabeth. So there are a lot of portraits of Elizabeth that look almost the same, but painted by different people. And you can find sort of, by the time we get to the third person that has repainted this portrait of Elizabeth, the clothes have gotten a little muddy. Like, she's still wearing what she was wearing, but like you're missing the pinheads, you're missing the, like, sort of the ruffle over the big farthingale hoop. You're missing some of the details. I equate that a lot to, you know, I'm going to take this book and I'm going to make a photocopy, and then I'm going to make a photocopy of the photocopy. I'm going to make the photocopy of the photocopy, and I'm just going to keep going. You start losing details, so those become a little suspect. The other thing you need to start watching for in portraits is if you're seeing the same clothing over and over again, is that a lot of times portrait artists would buy clothing or sort of be loaned clothing, would just set it up, would paint the face, and then go back to their studio and like paint the clothes. I know there are a couple of 1700s-ish women where it looks like they're all in the same dress. In reality, they never put the dress on. It was just sitting in an artist's studio somewhere. And if you can tell that you've got one of those portraits where the artist set the dress up and then painted it, that's another thing to just sort of keep aware of, that was a thing that was happening, because a lot of times in those there are sort of drag lines in the fabric that are not really the same as where the drag lines would be and the stress points would be if they were on a human body. So if you start seeing those and go, wait a minute, like that wouldn't do that on a body, you may have found one of those portraits that was clothes basically set up on a hanger so an artist could paint them. Again, keep looking at stuff and you will start seeing this as you get better and better and better and better. Art to trust back in the medieval hours, books of hours and illuminations. Obviously not all of them. We talked about monks trying to keep you out of hell in these. These are, especially the books of hours made for show and for really rich people, were handwritten and hand illustrated and show religious stories illustrated in the clothing of the time, mostly because that's what the illustrators knew. That's what they saw walking around outside the monastery all day. And because it was then, if they painted the folks you should sort of know, or the main characters in the book of hours in the clothing that you know, it was easy to differentiate into sort of other people, to sort of non-Western people, and to sort of people who are specifically different for whatever reason. So in this, you've got the example of the Luttrell Psalter, where you can see mostly men's clothing. And again, this is very rectangularly constructed still. And the center there, you can see lacing start to show up. And you can see a center seam happening there. And then in the Romance of the Rose, you can get even more detail. You can start seeing sort of a black band. You can see more lacing on both of them. You can tell that she's wearing, you know, a couple of different layers. She's got the white layer with the long sleeves. Then she's got a dress over that. On him, you can see that the hose are very tight. And what's fun about the Romance of the Rose, and part of why I like it, is you can see she's only partially dressed, and over on the bench, you can see her belt and her hat not on her head. Since I'm always interested in hats, I always look at hats not on heads for as much information as I can steal from them. So that was a fun find. Like I said, when we were talking about Dürer, woodcuts and studies, always good, because woodcuts are focused more on lines than on anything else. They wind up showing seams, they wind up showing lacings, especially if you're interested in Landsknecht or German stuff from about 1490 to 1600. Woodcuts are going to give you so much information. I was talking about the Miniver cap as well. Margaret Giggs here in the Hans Holbein portrait is wearing a Miniver cap. And you can see the lines in the fur, sort of where each individual mink was put on there. The other fun thing about her is you can see the pins holding her mysterious Tudor white strap down. And you can see the lacing sort of across the front of her bodice. One of the other things I have looked at a lot, again, because I'm interested in headwear, and a lot of these weird frilly veils show up in statues. Statuary. So statuary is usually more useful in looking at women's clothes than in men, because most of the statuary of this time are funeral, well, not most, but a lot of the statuary of the sort of 14th and 15th centuries are funeral effigies, and men were often wanted to be depicted in their armor. So a lot of times men on clothing, the men are only helpful from sort of the waist down if they're wearing the hose. It's really good if you're looking at clergy, because a lot of times clergy and the clothes the clergy were wearing show up sort of in a lot of detail on their statuary and on their effigies. Most of these were likely carved from looking at the dead person's clothes, sometimes probably on the dead person themselves, because a lot of times people would start their statuary, would start their effigy before they died, so they could approve it. And like I said, a lot of what I look at on effigy, they're a great place to look at headwear, because there's a lot of detail that goes in sort of around the face, and most artists also extend that to sort of headwear and ruffs and so forth, as you can see on both our Swiss mourner with her ruffly veil and on Mary Queen of Scots. And I love the statue of the Duchess of Berry, because you can see all of those sort of rolled pleats in the front of her houppelande, and as someone who cannot sculpt to save her life, that massively impresses me. All right, tapestry is our last sort of form of art that I'll go over. And tapestry is an interesting one. It's hard to get a whole lot of costume construction detail out of tapestry by itself, especially in the early years, because there's not a whole lot of detail. So if you look at the Bayeux tapestry, like the example I've gotten there, you can kind of tell what's going on, but there's not any like horribly good detail. You can tell it's probably rectangularly constructed. You can see there's probably a big cloak clasp sort of up here. There may be a different color at the hem on the man on the right. He may have sort of a keyhole collar. Rectangular construction, cloaks. It's a great place to start. When you get into later periods, though, tapestry starts getting a lot more involved and a lot more, I don't want to say pretentious, but like there is more of an effort to make the tapestry sort of bigger and more exciting. So one of the interesting things to look at in tapestry is how they depict in fabric or in thread and textile the textiles that people are wearing. So on this, you can see the sort of damask pattern in those gowns very clearly, and you can see how they depicted it sort of in thread and fabric. So I was like sort of looking at that and going, yes, okay, like the textile people are showing these textiles like this. That gives me a little more perhaps information into the textiles. And now, since we talked art to trust, I have about 10 minutes to get through art not to trust. Never trust, never, ever, 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 ever trust a pre-Raphaelite. I'm sure they were lovely people, but don't trust them when it comes to artwork and medieval stuff. They did the pre-Raphaelites did a lot of pseudo-medieval artwork that gets referred to in costume. So the Lady of Shalott and all of those. I tried to pick some of the big ones that people have seen before out here. They did a lot of detail work sort of in the style of early Italian paintings, but they didn't really know how the clothes were working. So they painted pseudo-medieval on a Victorian silhouette. And one of the easiest ways to avoid the pre-Raphaelites is to get a confirmed solid date range on whatever art it is you're looking at. So these guys were all painting in sort of the mid to late 1800s. So if you're looking for, medieval or earlier, or medieval or slightly later artwork to look at for costumes, and the painting was painted in 1889, back away slowly. And so on the slide, I've basically kind of given you an example of sort of what the giveaways for me are that I'm looking at a pre-Raphaelite or someone of that time period. So if you look at Hillel and Hillebrand, the meeting on the turret stairs, and you compare sort of her body shape to the 1864 corset, like she looks very much that silhouette. Like that's what these guys were looking at. That's what they were used to women being shaped like. He is not too bad as far as sort of the whole knightly outfit goes. There's a little excitement as to sort of what time period it is he's from. I've talked with armoring friends of mine, and they're like, yeah, he's kind of in the 12 to 1300s, but he's also kind of all over the place. So that one especially gets a little hinky. Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth is the other one I showed here, just because people are like, oh, Lady Macbeth, like medieval, okay, like great, she's Lady Macbeth. And this one is actually really fun because the costume that this portrait was painted from still exists, because it was a theater costume in about 1889. And you can see there both the portrait of Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth. You can see a picture of the actual costume from, I think, I want to say the show went up in like 1886, 1887. But then you can also see, even though the costumer was sort of making it medieval in the costume, you can see the 1889 sort of typical silhouette, which both that costume and Mrs. Terry both still have. So this is, again, one of those, like, as your eye gets better at saying, wait, this silhouette doesn't look right for the period, you can start saying, oh, this artwork is suspect. I don't know if I want to, base all of my research on that. All right, so our next art not to trust, Dover Books and the Mode In books. These are Victorian and later. If you're working in the Victorian time period and you want to look at Dover Books, these are not bad. If you want to look at sort of ethnic dress, the Victorians wanted to codify and label everything. So they did a lot of, like, I'm going to wander around and draw things that I see. For the things that the Victorians actually saw and, like, pretty much understood, like some ethnic dress, the Dover books aren't bad. But once you get back, since I'm looking mostly sort of pre-1600, they didn't see them. So they were usually copying from previous artwork and not paying that much attention, it seems, sometimes. And since the Dover books use these Victorian plates in like reinterpretations of the imagery, it again, we're sort of playing the like copy of a copy of a copy of a copy game. Which is, even though the Mode In, I think it's a 3 or 4 book series called the Mode In Hats, and the Mode In Hats and Headwear, and the Mode In Hair and something, and the Mode In like costumes and something. There's a whole series of the Mode In books. And they just sort of take that Victorian, I'm drawing a thing from other examples, example, and move it forward a little. Like, they're more recent than Victorian, but again, it's just someone sort of looking at the artwork and going, okay, I see it, and drawing in the shapes without necessarily understanding how they go together. All right, in my last 8 minutes, we're gonna do the speed run through. I'll give you my last slide, and then I'll give you the speed run through where to start researching, even if all you have is Google. We're gonna do this ultimate fast. So primary sources are best. And I'm sure anyone who's ever done a history class has heard this a billion times. Consider all research like a game of telephone. Everyone's played telephone. The closer you are to the original source, the person who said the thing first, the better your information is going to be. Because you've all played the game where someone says, I like Spam, and you get down to the other end and it's, I have 18 toes. That's what happens in history too. So the closer you can get to the original source, the better your research is going to be. So for this, it's find original materials, find original paintings, find original woodcuts, find original statuary, stained glass, illustrations and books from the time and the period and the location that you're interested in. Once you've found those originals, you can definitely then go back and sort of, as I was saying earlier, confirm with the Miniver caps, confirm sort of what you're seeing in non-art materials. So in wills, in lists of garments and royal wardrobes, and accounts from big events where people wrote down like, I went to the ball and so was wearing their fur coat. Sometimes, especially when you're looking at the Norse and sort of earlier clothing, passed down stories or myths. Some of the Norse myths talk about, you know, how this man was wearing his shirt open like a woman, or something like that. So even that then can start giving you clues as to how the clothing was worn and how possibly it was made. Sumptuary laws are one that people often will talk about but not think about in this context. Sumptuary laws will tell you what people wanted to wear, even if they weren't allowed to. So they're a great place to sort of look at what did people try to wear or try to get away with. Look at museum websites for primary sources. A lot of big museums have a lot of their art collection and some of their costumes online. If you're looking for a specific culture, try to find a big museum in that home country. Well, they may not have all of the sources that they should, because we all know that like cultural kidnappings in museums is an issue. They usually have at least sort of a decent collection of their stuff, whether it's, you know, the Russian museum has Russian stuff or the Finnish museum has Finnish stuff. The best way to find museum collections I have found is Google Arts and Culture, which is this huge index of digitized collections around the world. You can also then see sort of who's participating with Google, which museums are participating, and go directly to the museum site to do more research if you want to do it that way. Secondary sources. So secondary sources, even though primary sources are best, secondary sources are not bad per se. You just have to know how to find them. So a secondary source is a source that's not the original, but is synthesizing or pulling from the original. So my example is a Vermeer painting as the original source, and a secondary source is a redrawing in a cartoon style of the Vermeer for a book cover. It's useful because you can say this is the general idea of the Vermeer painting, but it may be missing sort of some of the minutia of the original. So see again, the pre-Raphaelites painting medieval women. They kind of get it, they kind of don't. I consider Pinterest a secondary source, and I often tell people Pinterest is both amazing and awful at the same time. A lot of making Pinterest useful is learning what's a valid source and what's not. So if it's an actual textile or if it's an actual piece from a museum, like the British Museum or the Hermitage, it's a good source. If it's art from an actual museum, a lot of times on Pinterest, they'll give you that little blurb of like, here's the pedigree of this, so you can trust it. Sometimes I'll sort of back research that again. If Pinterest is giving you blogs showing process photos or research images, confirm who they are and what they're doing. If it's someone I trust, I tend to trust their research. If it's just sort of, you know, Joe Blow in a fancy outfit, I tend to trust them less. There are a couple people on Pinterest that I trust no matter what. I'm going to murder this name, but Jana Seppala is a Finnish textile researcher who I follow, and she has never led me wrong. Morgan Donner, who everyone has heard of, does a great job of historically labeling her Pinterest stuff. Other folks I follow are Eva Anderson, Wilja de Golfia, which I have probably just murdered that name, apologies. Curious Frau, who is also M. McNeely, Mervi Passanen, and Gunta Dej. And those are all in the handout that I linked in the chat at the beginning of this, if folks want to check them out. One of the things Pinterest can be great at is giving you an opportunity to hone your eye. So if you type in like Cote Hardy England 1350 and you see, you know, 4 things that look the same and a 5th that's completely different, you have at least sort of a good direction to start going and to kind of see where that direction is pulling you. I believe that brings me down with 2 minutes left. I'm sorry, I tried to leave more time for questions, but with 2 minutes left for whatever questions people want to throw at me. I'll throw the link to this handout up in the chat again so folks can see it. I can stick around for a couple minutes. I know people want to go like see other presentations. Don't feel bad about running away, but I'll stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has questions and wants to ask them. Feel free to either drop them in the chat or probably just drop them in the chat at this point is easiest. Everyone, thank you guys so much for coming. I was like, I don't know if anyone will come. It's 2 p.m. on a Saturday on the East Coast. But I hope something I said was useful. Next time I aspire to talk less fast.